the kind of theme that I had in my mind is kind of like talk about emergence of life. But of course, I don't want to ask you to define life because I know your response. Both of you have been standing on this kind of response that life is a continuum. So we can kind of take it from there. But when we think of emergence of life, there is certainly a kind of transition we can think of. It's a transition of chemistry to biology. And both of the frameworks that you guys are studying, origin of life or developmental biology, both of them, they are kind of this example of this transition. So let's take that big picture view. What are like, how do you look at this continuum? How we can think of that continuum depending upon a bacteria or a mold or a planaria, living in a pond. So let's start with Nick.
Okay. I mean, you say a transition from chemistry to life, and I think both Mike and I would probably emphasize electrochemistry, or at least is borderline physics, really, in terms of what we're talking about. And so the key, I suppose, in my mind, is not a single moment where you switch from one thing into another one. Even when you introduce information, there isn't a single moment. But there's a process, and that process is partly over time and it's partly structured. And the thing that I like most, I think, about the kind of environments I talk about for the origin of life, which are mostly hydrothermal systems, but the nice thing about those systems is really that they have a structure which is cell-like, and they can template cells that, in effect, can grow within them. And when I say cell-like, the key attribute in my own mind to cells is the charge on the membrane. It's really that defines the cell from its environment, and which coordinates everything that's happening inside the cell. And so at the origin of life, you have effectively a structure with charges on barriers that are cell-like structures, and it gives you this as a setup from the very beginning. And then there's lots of interesting questions that we haven't really answered yet. But how does charge organize things? It certainly does, but to what extent and in what ways?
Mike?
Yeah. I think what I'd like to do is take. I mean, I agree with everything Nick just said, but I'll maybe take one step back and kind of talk about this question of physics versus chemistry versus biology. I've come more and more to the view that what we're really talking about in almost all of these problems has to be cashed out with respect to an observer. So to me, the question of whether something is physics or is it chemistry or is it biology or is it psychology or is it what is it going to be, right? It should be specified relative to an observer who chooses a particular lens. So one experience that I often have is that I'll describe some amazing thing that the biological systems do, and people say, "Oh, wow, this is super cool." And then if I happen to have the mechanism for it, I will say, here's the mechanism. And then people say, "Oh, well, that's just physics. Well, that's not memory. I can see how that works. That's not memory. That's just physics." And so there's this amazing a kind of moving of the goalposts, so that basically all of the interesting stuff, right? Cognition, intelligence, memory, decision making, problem solving, meaning, all of these things. The minute you show some sort of a mechanism underneath, then some people say, "Wow, that wasn't it at all. What I really mean is this other thing. This is just this is just physics, right?" So what I prefer is this idea that you have a set of different tools that you can bring to bear. And you can take anything and look at it and say, "Well, that's physics." And well, guess what you'll see? You'll see physics. If you bring your voltmeter, right? If you bring your ruler and your weigh scale and stuff like that, guess what you'll see? You'll see physics. And if you bring other kinds of tools that are conceptual tools that are better suited to recognize agency, so maybe you bring something that recognizes virtual governors or it recognizes a decision making or something, well, then maybe you'll find that, and maybe you won't. So it's an empirical process, right? So that's kind of my view on this. I think anything can be seen as just physics, and many things can also be seen as something much more and looked at a higher level.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the origin of life is kind of an exemplar of exactly that, because there are people who come from completely different disciplines in terms of training. So coming as a physicist or as a chemist or as a geologist or as a cosmologist or a biologist and so on. And you realize when you try to talk to people with a very different background that that you don't share the same language. And however much you try to be a scientist, you find that you're conditioned and you have some blinkers on which make you see the problem with that toolkit. And half of the problem that I have in working on the origin of life is to try and dismantle my own toolkit and replace it with, well, just try to be a scientist. Just try to bring all these things together, because it is a question in all of those disciplines. And that's just the beginning of life. And once we get into life, it just becomes more sophisticated and more of a problem. It's just that you can see it really clearly at the origin of life.
Yeah, I think of course, it can also be the psychology itself that we like to categorize stuff. It's this concept of categorical thinking itself. But let's not go into the psychology right now. But maybe we can kind of replace the emergence of life, like kind of idea, to emergence of complexity, because certainly integration does happen. Stealing a word from Nick Lane's when we were chatting last time, you used this word of integration rather than reductionist approach. So
right.
When we think of this integration of some sort of simpler molecules, then we are kind of talking about this biological system. So let's probably kind of talk about the properties of biological systems. So what can be those, or what are the key innovations which enable, life forms?
I'll pick just one thing, which is what Nick already mentioned, which is resting potential. And the thing that one interesting thing about resting potential is that in many ways it's a coarse-grained sort of higher level entity, because it's different. If you are a mechanism that keys off of resting potential, it is not the same as keying off of potassium concentration or sodium concentration or chloride concentration, right? It's this slightly higher level thing. And so if you're in fact, it's one of these things, like many other things in cognitive science. If you want to be a micro reductionist, you might say, well, there's no such thing. You might say, right, if you're sort of a Laplacian, the demon kind of creature, right, you might say there's no resting potential. What there is there's some sodiums and there's some potassiums, and those are your low level kind of bedrock. But what's cool about resting potential is one of many things is that it's one of the first steps up that I think life does in generalizing, coarse graining, getting good at noticing large scale control elements that are not reducible down to individual details, right? And while all of these, of course, the resting potential is of course a consequence of the various ions you have, the fact that you can have the same resting potential from different concentration of ions, right? As long as you change them out correctly, right? So you can vary the low level details and still get the same resting potential. And conversely, you can get different resting potentials with exactly the same genetics, for example, with the same ion channels, because they could be open or closed. So you get this interesting bow tie kind of architecture where there's this like functional node in the middle where things sort of feed into it, and then multiplicities come out of it. But it itself is this super interesting node from the perspective of information theory, control, and all of that.
So Nick, before you respond to that, I will add another point here. So, because the mainstream view is that the key innovation is the genome, right? So let's kind of get it out of the way already and kind of already mention it. Why the information is not genome itself, but why we are talking about the resting potential.
I don't think that either of us would want to be pigeonholed as kind of anti-genome. It's just that the genome's not the only thing that's going on. And as soon as Mike is talking about generating effectively a single parameter, which is the resting potential, which could be multiple different ions, which is going to require multiple different pumps in the membrane, but they're pumping against a pressure which is pushing back against them. So there is a unified entity, which is the resting potential, which is kind of integrating everything. And the trouble I think with only seeing life as a genome it tends to insist that the genome invents cells as well and invents structure and space and charge and all of these other things. And it really doesn't. It's capable of generating them, but it never really makes some membrane. Membranes come from other membranes. The spatial setting of the cell is, it comes from other cells. And then people say, well, there's a chicken and egg problem at the origin of life. Where does the cell come from? Well, if you've got a cell-shaped hole and cells, it's not difficult actually to make a bilayer membrane surrounding an aqueous space. That's a cell-like structure. It's not a difficult thing to do. But as soon as you've got that, then information has some meaning, and genes begin to have some meaning. But they're still they need there's got to be some higher level of integration for just to use the word meaning. Otherwise, everything's a bit, and they don't relate to each other. So I think that is why charge is so important. One way that I like to think of it is if you have. I like to think of individual cells in part because I work on them and in part because they're just easier for me to grasp. The whole central nervous system is just too big and complicated for me to really comprehend. But if you think about a single cell and you think about the amount of biochemistry that's going on inside it, there's 1 billion reactions a second going on in a bacterial cell. And a lot of them are repeat things. So you could imagine there may be 10,000 Krebs cycles all spinning at the same time, and they're all plugged into the membrane. And so the rate at which they spin and the direction in which they spin is going to depend on this larger factor, which is the membrane potential of the bacterium. So to pump against that potential requires a certain force. And that force is coming from the environment that you're in. Do you have the substrate to power the pumping, or did you run out, or was there any oxygen there, or whatever? So it's immediately giving you a kind of a feed in of what the environment is that you're in, and then a feedback, which is which is integrating all these 10,000 different cycles going around every second. How do they all know what the other one is doing? How do you integrate all of that into the behavior of a cell, which is capable of kind of coordinating all of this? So you need that higher level property, and I think that's where it's coming from.
So I think the hardware software analogy goes well here. Can we use that analogy to explain this integration? What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's a very good lens on all of these things, because we know that when we look at the genome, what do we see? We don't see any of the large scale kinds of things that you might be interested in. How many eyes? What kind of legs? Does it have legs? You don't see any of that. What you see is protein sequences. So the micro level hardware that every cell gets to have. Now, as Nick points out, the context and the rest of the cell is critical. Otherwise, this stuff means nothing. And then all of the actual large scale features, the behavior, is then the result of the physiology, literally the software. So in a kind of a very simplistic analogy, you're looking at a typical computer. Sure, it's important that you have the right silicon and copper and all of that. Yes, you need all that stuff. But after that, all the action is in the software. All the action's in the algorithm. It's in the electrical physiology of what this thing does. And I think it's no accident that our information technology and the way our brains work and non-neural bioelectricity, all of them use these electrical networks. They're just a really powerful tool for processing information, and that's what the again, no, as Nick said, not to take anything away. You need certain hardware, so you need the genome to give you certain things. But you don't get the membrane from the genome, you don't get the cytoskeleton structure, you get the proteins, but you don't get the structure that templates on the previous cytoskeleton. All of these physiological things are over and above the genetic hardware.